All right, so we will call the September meeting of the Government Operations Committee into action here. The first thing we have is approval of the minutes from the August 15th meeting. And I think Commissioner Davenport noticed a correction.
There's one correction. We were all via WebEx
All
in
right.
our last meeting.
Would you like to make a motion to accept with that change?
Motion to approve with the change.
I'll second.
All right, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, unanimous, fantastic. Okay, and so now we're gonna move on to our one item on the agenda here, which is to consider the limitations on the number of short-term rentals an individual can manage in residential zones. And so I think got some presentations set up for us, Josh.
Yes, so good to be with you all this evening. Good to be in person and virtually streaming. We're going to start tonight with Attorney Hines talking a little bit about the Atlanta Ordinance, as well as some of the legality around the questions that the mayor put in his charge. So she's going to unpack some of the pros and cons of that, and then we're going to transition to a presentation from our Chief Information Officer. Travis has joined us, and he's going to walk us through a presentation that's not that different than what y'all saw 2 years ago. So the GOC looked at this a couple years ago, and then the state changed. The state passed a bill that actually started collecting revenue, so the GOC decided to stop at that point. So host compliance is one of the systems that looks at short-term rentals, and Travis has reached out to them to pull together an updated presentation. So we have some data for you. We have some opportunities that it's just one system. Obviously, there's other systems that do this, but it's just one example of what's out there in terms of software systems. And then what we hope to do is close the evening by actually talking a little bit about y'all's goals and the problems you're trying to solve with this charge. So we as staff can better understand what we're trying to do and then bring back more information to you next month. But with that, I'm going to kick it to Attorney Hines.
Great, excellent. So I think to start off, what might be helpful just to say is that like this is a really hot button topic in the legal community right now, particularly across cities and county governments, not just short-term rentals, but also just all of the I guess permutations that may exist of this kind of concept. So we just had a seminar earlier in September that we all attended where this topic came up. Our listserv has been talking about similar topics, and it was also covered in April at another seminar. So again, attorneys are talking about this, and the reason that they're talking about it is because it's a really difficult kind of ask in terms of how do you address this in a way that is legally compliant and that addresses what you want to achieve. And so part of why Josh and I were talking about getting some guidance from you all about what you actually want to achieve is because, as you'll see today, I'm going to show you two different ordinances, and they actually they have some ends that kind of overlap things that they're trying to achieve, but others that are radically different. And so I don't really know exactly where the GOC wants us to move forward, and getting some feedback would be helpful. Additionally, I think that one is more vulnerable to challenge than the other, and so that's something for you all to consider as well. And I'm going to touch base on a little bit of that today. Just because I think a lot of it has been said before and honestly isn't a great secret, but I may retain some things to be confidential if I need to prepare a memo or anything like that on that in the future. But I think one thing that's helpful, and like I said, we're talking about this in lots of different permutations. So short-term rentals, the big hot item that's coming up right now is these developments where they're building single family, but the sole purpose is to rent them out. And so there's local governments who are saying, hey, we want to stop that from happening. There's even the questions of, is it okay for someone to rent out their pool or rent out their yard to someone's dogs, for their kids to come play. So there's all sorts of ideas of how these apps are coming up that allow people to rent out their property in some way that certainly may impact governments. And so one thing that I think was really helpful in our listserv discussions about this is to really think about what the purpose of zoning is. And so I just kind of want to read from this. And I think this is fair to say is that when we talk about regulations on zoning, it's meant to regulate the use, occupancy, form, and flow of our land uses. So like density, building materials, things like that. I think everyone agrees that you get into a much less firm footing when you're talking about regulating ownership. In other words, who can own, how many can you own, and for instance, apologies, who can own, how many can own, and then types of ownership. So one of the things they're talking about, granted a little bit more in the development example I was talking about, but like, is it really in the government's interest to care whether someone has fee simple ownership of a property or whether they're leasing property or something like that? Like fundamentally, if they have housing, I'm not sure that the government should be concerned. So bearing all of that kind of in mind, what I'd like to do is go through the Atlanta Ordinance. And since Cynthia already has this pointed up, I'll just go ahead and talk about this. So this is section, I'm sorry, my vision is not awesome, so I have to look at my notes. So that's 36-74-30. And this is, we've talked about this before in the GOC, but I thought you all might want to see it. And Cynthia, can you zoom in on that at all so people can maybe read it a little bit better? It's actually, if you'll scroll down, it's the bottom part. There we go. So up a little bit further, it's the second paragraph. There you are. So what it says, no local government is authorized to perform investigations or inspections of residential rental property unless there's probable cause. And then it goes on to say, and in no event may a local government require the registration of residential rental property. So this is the key crux that all of these local governments are dealing with. And obviously a lot of local governments feel that either they're not concerned about it or they feel like they have an answer to it because there's at least, 17 or 18 other local governments who have short-term rental policies. There's an argument by one local government that if you look at the intent from when this was passed, that they were looking at registration of long-term, like 12-month rental properties, and that there was a question of invasion of privacy. If, for instance, I had to say Sherry Hines is renting this property on Millage Avenue and that we were creating government records about where people were renting, that was why the governor signed this bill into law. But unfortunately, it was done in 2003. So long before the short-term rental, industry really took off or even hit. And so there's no contemplation that it would apply to short-term rentals. I think it's fair to say that, but that language is pretty darn stark about, not requiring registration of residential rental property. So that's kind of the challenge. So if we could move on to the Atlanta Ordinance now. And I'll probably just talk through most of that. The Atlanta Ordinance is more in line with the charge. And I think what you'd see if you look through it is that its primary goal, although I don't think it's stated very clearly, is really twofold. And I'm not being critical of it. I just mean that the recitals don't come out and state that our goal is to reduce the number of short-term rentals because we want to address affordable housing. Instead, their recitals, some of which is highlighted, that's their highlighting, not mine. But it talks about trying to address, perpetuate the identity and other benefits neighbors derive from being members of their specific communities. And you can scroll down a little bit. Yeah, it is actually that highlighted language. And then they talk about how an overabundance of short-term rentals increases a commercial element to residential uses. So it's clear they're thinking about the fact that there's this, overabundance, as they say, of short-term rentals, but they don't come out and say we're trying to address affordable housing at any point in the actual language of this ordinance. They do later say, if you scroll to the next page, that they are there to protect the integrity of the city's neighborhoods. So it's that kind of middle section, that last line there. And so if you'll scroll down just a tiny bit more, there we go, perfect. So this is the actual rules kind of the short-term rental license that they're requiring. And if you all can look to D, I think that is kind of a key issue here. I am being a little critical of the ordinance there when I say that I don't think that language is very clear. It says that you can have a license for your primary residence and one additional dwelling unit, quote, without any additional requirements, fees, permits, licenses, zoning, or related restrictions. I think an average person reading that is going to say, haha, I can get more than just my one additional unit if I comply with additional requirements, fees, permits. However, if you read the entire ordinance, there is no such additional provisions. And I called their staff and spoke with them today, and they said that nope, you can only have your primary residence and your additional dwelling unit. You do in fact have to register your primary residence first, even if you don't intend to rent out your primary residence. And that there's no way for you to get any further. So I think this is an issue I would want to address if we were to try to impose it. I don't really know why that's there. Perhaps they were planning on offering additional restrictions and then changed their mind and this is a holdover. But in either case, Atlanta staff have confirmed for me that they only allow 2. And so this gets to that kind of overarching problem that I talked about at the beginning, which is that, you know, how do governments justify saying you can't own more than one additional dwelling unit that you rent out? You know, if you can purchase additional properties, how do we tell you that you can't rent them out? And so that gets more, I think, arguably to the ownership question rather than a zoning question. Now, I'll tell you, both of the ordinances that we're going to look at don't really follow the true zoning route that some of the other ordinances across the state have done. And by that, I mean, there are ordinances that say you can only have short-term rentals in residential or commercial or certain types of commercial mixed use kind of zoning or even agricultural. That's probably the most traditional zoning approach and it has its own problems. Both of the ones we're going to talk about today just create sort of licensing or registration type systems. And this limits across all zones in Atlanta. So that's kind of the key issue to point out. It goes for, it has all sorts of different application requirements and fees. Because the second prong of what this Atlanta ordinance does is to make sure that there's a contact person, and you can see that right there. Thank you, Cynthia. You know, it addresses parking, right? So that we know how many people will be kind of affecting the roadways nearby potentially. It imposes limits on how many people per bedroom, I think it's 2 per bedroom, can utilize one of these rentals. Let's see if there's anything else I really wanted to highlight. There's all sorts of, you know, policies reverting, like if you get a certain number of violations, if you have 3 violations in a year, then you get a suspension of your license. You can't renew it again for another 12 months. And then it, of course, subjects them to the hotel motel tax that I think Josh mentioned previously, which has always been kind of an issue, right? That hotels, it's easy to collect that from. Short-term rentals who are engaging in the business of lodging, you know, how some don't even know it's being rented, so you can't necessarily collect it unless the platform is doing it. So that's kind of a quick overview of the Atlanta ordinance. Does anyone have any questions about the Atlanta ordinance at this time?
I mean, theirs is across the board. They don't take into consideration.
Correct.
And some of the concerns that I've heard around the Atlanta one is the fact they require someone to actually live in Atlanta to be able to operate this, and the people therefore outside aren't able to. And so that's some of the legal issues with.
Yes, absolutely. And I should have said that. Yes, because it requires you to have a primary residence in the city of Atlanta and you must register your primary residence beforehand. I think that's a big legal question. And you know, we're always talking about equal protection. We're saying, are you violating someone's rights because of a protected class? And I don't think that this necessarily triggers a protected class, but they would have to have a rational basis to say, why are we restricting it to people who live within the city limits of Atlanta? And it's hard, I think, to come up with a good explanation why someone who lives in, I don't know, Brookhaven couldn't possibly manage a short-term rental that maybe they purchased when they were going to Georgia State or something like that. And so I just think that's a tough argument, and maybe they'll be able to make that. His rational basis is still a low standard, it's a low bar, but that's going to be a challenge. And I'm glad you reminded me. There was something else I wanted to say. One of the big things to note about the City of Atlanta ordinance is that they're clearly having problems with it. It was passed in 2021. They have been pushing back enforcement of it continuously ever since. I think it's been pushed back at least 3 times. It still is not actively in enforcement, and part of, at least what we've been able to figure out from news articles, is that part of the problem is that they only have about 3% of people who are in compliance right now and actually registered. And I think that makes sense when you know that you have a statute that says that they can't force you to register your rental property. I mean, you know, I think it's not a big jump in logic to think that their attorneys are saying, ignore it. You know, what are they going to do to you? And we just recently got an update from GMA, where we kind of heard that The lobbyists on behalf of these short-term rentals might be more okay with an Atlanta type ordinance, but they are certainly anticipating litigation and have sort of indicated to other cities and counties that you may just kind of want to watch and sort of let us be the test case and kind of see what happens. Obviously, we don't have to do that, but they are certainly anticipating litigation, and I think that's reasonable to expect based on their ordinance. To be clear, I think theirs is not as defensible as the Glenn County one we're going to go over in a second. Any other questions right now?
And we're only asking questions about the Atlanta ordinance. Okay.
Oh, yeah, look, if you want to ask another question now, that's fine.
I never liked the Atlanta ordinance from what I read from AJC. Like you said, it has a lot of issues with it. Just walk me through the steps. So we can't regulate who owns the property, but we can regulate the occupancy of the property. Can you explain legally someone actually living in a home versus just staying in a home? What's the difference? So if I come to your house and stay for a week and you're gone, I'm essentially living in your home for that week. But
We took on homestead exemption, because like, isn't that how we usually
Yeah.
somebody living in a property is if they claim on homestead exemption and
Well, I think that's a little bit difficult to say, and I'll give a personal example. My mother-in-law has a second home, and she kind of splits the difference. Her homestead is always in Atlanta. Even though the other home is strictly for her use and she doesn't rent it out, but she may spend 6 months a year there. So I think it's hard to say like she's not living there, even though she doesn't qualify for the home, because you can't have two homestead exemptions, and she's not a resident of where that is. And I'm sure there's lots of other people with sort of similar situations, or certainly some people with similar situations. I'm not entirely sure what you're asking, but I think the thing to say is that governments are legitimately interested in land use. And so when we talked we heard from Ken Gerard, who's a very, very good attorney who's involved in a lot of this litigation. He said, look, short-term rentals are not anything fancy. They're just another type of land use, just like anything else that we deal with. In fact, they're commercial land use. And so there is certainly an argument to move forward with some sort of regulation based on zoning. It's just neither of these two ordinances do that.
Right.
And the problem that we've talked about at 2 years ago with the GOC, and I'm happy to talk about it now, is that if you do decide to move forward with an approach that limits them to certain zones, the problem is that you have all of these properties that are grandfathered in as long as their use was continual and regular. Or continuous and regular. And the problem, of course, then becomes how do you define continuous and regular? And there's no case law on it. And so the problem that we experience here is, say I own a property in Athens and I want to rent it out 6 weekends a year for football games. Is that continuous and regular? Does it change if I've continuously done that every year for the past 5 years? Or does it need to be like you rent your house out, I don't know, for 5 days or 10 days or 20 days every quarter, for instance? And we just don't have any guidance on that. So that is an area where we may see some litigation in the future.
So we can regulate family members staying in a home, living in a home.
You're about the single family.
Yeah, single family.
Yeah, the definition.
But we can't regulate who stays in the home for a short term. You see what I'm trying to get at? Like,
Yeah, I think we could. It's just, I think that there's an argument that it needs to best be tied to zoning.
yes.
And then that becomes troublesome because there's all these folks that are grandfathered in.
Okay.
That's sort of the problem.
On the grandfathered in, I wondered something. So I wondered if we could only really recognize one was grandfathered in, and what was the term that you used, that they were continuous
And regular.
and regular. If they actually were doing it legally, meaning that they had a business occupation license.
Right. That's a great question. And what's interesting, because I looked in, I think it's Atlanta's ordinance, they don't even require a business occupation license. They think of this as kind of their license. I don't think that argument would win at the end of the day. I think as long as they've been using that property, I think they could say, look, we're doing it legally. We didn't know we needed to pay this, occupation tax. I don't know if a court would think that that's enough to find in their favor. But I will say one thing that's hopeful at both of the CLEs we just went to, and Kendra had spoke to this specifically, the fact that a non-conforming use has been grandfathered in, that someone has established that property right, does not mean it is permanent. So again, the problem is we do not have any case law that gives us any guidance of what a phase out might look like. And there's some ideas that we could talk about what, we might try. But if we started today and we said, hey, if you've been using this continuously and regularly, you have to apply for a license to let us know, we'll approve you. And then we keep track and then we phase out, I don't know, say 5 years, that might be defensible. We just don't have clear guidance on it.
Could we request data from the platforms to determine for what period of time properties have been active on the platform?
We could request it, but they're never going to give it to us. And so that's the reason, and Travis is going to talk about host compliance and these other different companies. And that's one of the things of all of these, local governments that I think are kind of putting their resources behind managing this as effectively as possible. They all are using these because it's the only way to find the addresses. It's the only way to get all that data to know how often things are being rented, how many rentals you have out there. So that may help us once we have kind of a bank of that data. We can say, to the best of our knowledge, you've only rented this out once this past year. But we really won't know until we actually start to get that data.
Especially professors or something who might be out of town for the summer and rent their property out. And that's a significant amount of time.
If it's more than 30 days, that would typically not be a short-term rental. Now, I'm guessing not a lot of people are renting the house for the whole summer, but if they were, that wouldn't fall under this category.
Yeah, the companies are under no obligation to share the data. We get revenue from them now and they don't give any descriptive data. It's just, here's the revenue. So.
And I'll tell you, there's attorneys watching that because there's always the question of, are they actually giving us as much money as they
Wasn't there software out there that would kind of scrape their platform?
Yeah, we're gonna get to that. We're gonna get to that.
Software out there that would scrape it of that data. That would be able to pull like how many properties in this area.
Scoopers got to come in with
Yeah.
letters tonight.
Let's move on to the Glenn County one and then we
Yeah.
can get to it, yeah. No,
Yeah.
this is good,
So in terms of Glenn County probably is the most defensible ordinance. And they are making a really creative argument. So definitely kudos to their attorney. What they're saying is we're not requiring a registration of rental property for the purpose of registration. Instead, there's a statute that says that local governments can determine how taxes are to be collected. And because you have a local accommodation excise tax that we all agree that these short-term rentals should be paying because they're basically operating as hotels or sort of rooms for rent. They call it guest rooms or hotels. That they can set up a parameter, a scheme, basically. I don't mean that in a bad way, but just like a system to collect those taxes. And in so doing, they put some requirements about the ability to like the requirements, for instance, to identify a contact and things like that. And so again, this is not zoning. This is not limiting the number of units that will be available in any way. People in Glenn County can have as many as they want. But they are going to have to pay those taxes. And there's a specific requirement that they actually give a receipt to the person renting it to confirm that the tax has been paid. Because I guess fundamentally the tax is on the renter, not the operator. So I don't have a whole lot to go through this specifically. These first pages is the definitions. But I guess we can scroll down to the next part where it talks about. So I just want to pause right here. I think the important thing about this is, even though it says imposition rate of tax, to be clear, they're not creating a new tax. They're just setting up a system to collect a tax that already is existing. And then can you scroll down to 25? There you go, the exemptions. And so this just makes it really clear that this is only for what we would typically think of as short-term rentals. And again, definitions are all over the board, but it's usually 30 days or less of continuous occupancy. And there's a couple other different exceptions. So this is just a really interesting way of handling it because it does arguably get around the registry. I don't know if that argument is gonna win the day because, if you're a person who owns a short-term rental, you're still saying, but you're forcing me to register my property. And, maybe we would agree with you with this policy if all you made me do was pay the tax, but you're making me provide like a contact person who's available 24 hours. And you're, these different things that are not in and of themselves necessary for me to pay the tax. But otherwise, their ordinance is relatively bare boned. They require them to keep records. Let's see. Yeah, and then of course they provide for the violations. So it's an interesting option. And what they said, I'll tell you candidly, what Glenn County's attorney said, two things. One, they haven't had a challenge of this ordinance. But part of the reason they think that they haven't is they worked for apparently 12 years with all of their local partners and people of interest to try to come up with something that everybody thought was reasonable. So take that for whatever it's worth. He said, secondly, even with this and even with everybody agreeing, enforcement is just an incredible challenge. And they're still struggling to actually enforce it.
And they're not using like host compliance or any kind of.
I'm not sure. I would think that they probably are.
It might be, we've got a list in the PowerPoint.
Man, sounds familiar.
Yeah, I'd have to check with them, and I'm happy, if you guys are interested in going this route, I will absolutely follow up with their attorney and get some more information.
Yes, for me.
Okay.
Because I believe I'm reviewing my notes from, we had a discussion a year, 2 years ago, down like COVID.
Yeah.
We had talked about this, but we were waiting for the Georgia. Is it possible to pull up the 367430 Georgia code again?
It's that first one.
Yeah, so that requires the taxes to be paid. I guess what Glenn County's saying is it's required, but we don't know if you're actually paying it, so we're gonna make you prove that you're paying it.
So that's the proof. The legal question I have, like the probable cause to believe that there is been a violation of applicable codes and that no local government is authorized to perform investigation or inspection.
Mm-hmm.
So tie that into using host and us figuring out who are the Airbnbs or the VRBO and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope, again, I don't know if it'll work out quite the way we would expect it to, but the hope would be that, and I gather from reading their website that what happens is once they identify people who are not registered with them, but who are clearly renting out the property, that they send them a first kind of like warning notice that says, hey, we've noticed that you've rented out your property, you need to register. And then after that, that's when they can start hitting people with penalties if they fail to do so. But that obviously, again, requires them to catch the person first, which again, hopefully the company that they're working with can help them with that. But, it just kind of depends. And I know Austin can certainly speak to this, that we just have a lot of challenges with enforcing any kind of ordinances that relate to behavior inside of a home, because people obviously enforce member protections in their home. And so if, police get a call because of a party house and police go up to that and say, hey, are you guys short-term, are you guys renting this? And they say, no, we live here. That's kind of the end of that conversation, other than please turn it down or whatever. Like, if someone doesn't admit that it's a short-term rental and we don't approve, like from host compliance, it's hard to take any kind of action against that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Oh, yeah, there's not gonna be any. Sorry. Yeah.
One other thing I do think is important to point out, because this is the other statute that comes into play, is the home rule section, and that's in, and I didn't send a copy of this to you, Cynthia, but it's OCGA 36-35-6B.
But we can send links out to everybody.
You guys
later.
can send us that.
Yeah.
Sure.
36.
36-35-6B. And what it basically says is, look, all the powers that are given to local communities under the Home Rule Act shall not include the power to take any action affecting the private or civil law governing private or civil relationships. And so that's kind of the fundamental argument against sort of the ownership restriction issue. In other words, what right playing devil's advocate, what right does the government have to say that I can't own 6 different residential properties and rent them out? What right does the government say I can't own 6 cars and rent them out, or any other kind of form of property? And of course, the argument on the other side is to say, well, the government is interested in the public health and safety and welfare, and we believe that the character of neighborhoods is important to maintain, which is the argument behind the single-family residential definition of family requirement as well. And because we value the idea of home occupancy, we can regulate it. But these are just all arguments that can play out on either side, and we just don't know how they'll play out. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the big thing that I wanted to talk about today. But I'm happy to entertain any other questions or turn it over to Travis.
I guess my one question, and this is a hard one. I mean, so in the Glenn County, I guess I'm seeing they have a lot of the same administrative challenges that anybody else would with this, but I'm not seeing very large benefits that they're receiving from this ordinance being in existence. It seems like they're not at all having an impact on the number of rentals. They're not receiving any kind of extra revenue to help them deal with the rentals.
I think they are arguably getting extra revenue.
Okay.
So
extra revenue that they would deservedly get, just
Yes.
it's more, yeah.
Yeah, so like imagine, I think most people are managing short-term rentals through Vrbo or Airbnb or whatever. But if there's someone who isn't, this will still capture that. And it also gives them some added protection to be able to ensure that those platforms, to the best of anyone's ability, are actually giving them the money that they appear to be entitled to. I can tell you that lawyers are waiting to file that class action the moment there's any proof that they're not. Because they're not providing us with that data. The other thing that I think that can be done even without an ordinance with things like post compliance, and I know Travis is going to talk about it, is that they provide like the 24-hour hotlines and the sort of the customer service end of things that we really don't have to be able to take complaints 24 hours and to actually address things with the owners. And so I think that's what I've kind of gathered from Glenn County that they've been able to do by getting this registration. At least it helps them communicate with those owners to address problems when they arrive. And then there are the ability to violate, for different things. But you're right. It's mostly just make sure they pay the tax.
Okay. And then you're talking about the difference with the zoning and how neither one of these takes the zoning route. I did look at a little bit Greene County, Georgia's, in which they require. They've created short-term rental overlay districts that you can only create them. So would that be more of an example of using the zoning kind of structure? And you feel like that's a little bit more defensible because?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. If you say that, I don't know, for example, and this is actually the opposite of the case, but say we had a lake that was very popular and drew a lot of residential rentals like this. Maybe you create an overlay district where you specifically allow short-term rentals there because it's a desirable area and it just makes sense. It's kind of a commercial area already versus a very traditional residential neighborhood. It's not what most communities are doing, but if you wanted to take that tack, I think that would make a lot of sense. Because again, you're just regulating land use and that's sort of the character of that area.
Okay. Yeah, that does. Thank you. Yeah.
And we can look at others. I mean, Savannah is another one that has a really unique system and theirs hasn't been challenged yet either. Because they have all of these historic districts, they have each district set up so that they only allow a certain number of vacation rentals in each district. And I think their argument is we're trying to preserve the residential character. And if we don't do that, people will literally buy up everything here and turn it into a commercial property. Now, whether that ends up winning the day in court is a whole other question. But they're not saying you can't own all of the, say, 30 permits in an area, but they're just saying sort of first come, first serve. Once they're gone, you join the wait list. So that's another unique one that's out there.
And they had some trouble with the grandfathering in though too, right? With the same.
Exactly. Everybody does because it's a vested property right of a non-conforming use. And until someone either abandons it or sells the property, they have that right. And we do have the case to prove that, fortunately.
All right. If there's no more questions, I'm sure then we can move on and hear more about Homestead Exemption.
All right, so as Cynthia pulls up Travis's presentation, just wanted to remind everybody, hey, all three of you were on GOC when we last talked about this.
Yeah.
But we were looking at this prior to COVID, and it was right about the time when COVID came that we stopped. And part of the reason was we weren't sure what COVID was going to do to short-term rentals. Right, so one of the things as a GOC that y'all asked, as we talked about this last meeting, was for us to dust off the host compliance presentation. So Travis Cooper, our CIO, worked with host compliance. So if you remember, we did an RFI back then as part of the GOC's recommendation to see what all different systems there were. And we heard from a number. So this is just one of those systems, but it was easier for Travis to go back to this group because we worked with them and pulling this together last time. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Travis. He's going to walk us through it.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. 2 years ago, whenever I was tasked with presenting to you guys, the focus was really tax revenues. And so that presentation had some data, so it really talks about how we collect revenue from the system. The product still does that, but this is more focused on the address listings and the compliance piece. This product is used, they claim, by these 16 different municipalities throughout Georgia. I do not see Clinton County. This Savannah uses our own permitting system to do theirs.
These are Granicus.
Yeah,
I mean, there's others that do.
Well, host compliance is owned by Granicus.
Oh, are they? Okay, sorry,
Yeah.
apologize.
Yeah. And so they ran the numbers and they found 938 unique rental units, not counting Winterville that they did not include. We're going to get that data. But there's 1,042 listings. So some of the properties are listed on multiple sites. As you can see, they're kind of, for the most part, in certain areas.
In the loop, most of them.
The red and the blue, the red is Airbnb and the blue is Expedia, which purchased VRBO and HomeAway. So they're all under the Expedia umbrella now. Our average nightly rate in Clarke County is $228 per night. And of those listings, 72% occur in single-family homes and 20% occur in multifamily homes. The unknown home types are more the non-traditional home types, such as RVs. And almost 90% are entire home rentals and only 11% are partial home rentals. Year-over-year growth, Clarke County is seeing 26% year-over-year rentals growth.
If you think about what we're coming out of, that you would expect to see some big growth numbers
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
And just for a quick breakdown of the majority of the listings in Clarke County are being sold through Airbnb. Again, Expedia purchased VRBO, and I believe HomeAway. So they're combined under the Expedia umbrella. So just to give you guys a refresher, the host compliance platform, number one, they provide address identification. And I'll speak to that in a moment. They also provide compliance monitoring. They can provide permitting and registration, tax collection, a 24/7 hotline, as Sherry mentioned. You sure you don't want to do this presentation?
No.
Okay. They do rental activity monitoring to see when units are actually being rented. And that last bubble that's hard to see for us here is they do offer consulting services in helping draft regulations where they've seen success in other parts of the country. They can offer those services as well. So the address identification, how that works is they just send their amazing AI robots out into the internet and they scan all 60 plus websites that are in this business. And they pick all the text, all the graphics from each of the listings. And once they've downloaded all that information, they then use more AI and match the pictures and all the data that they can find with Google Maps, Public, any sort of information that's out there in realtor websites that actually have a photograph of the property, and they match it. And so what they'll do is they'll get a high rate of confidence with a listing and then pass it to a human being. So there's a final human being that actually verifies that, yes, the AI actually is right. This is the property, and then it gets listed on the website in our portal. So we're able to see all of this data in an easy to use platform that we can actually export to our desktops or other systems. And their system, as you can see, grabs the actual screenshots of the listings. And what they'll do is they'll actually, I go too far ahead. They'll actually timestamp the listing every few days. I think it's every 2 or 3 days they'll scrape the websites. And so once they get all the snapshots, they put a timestamp on it and store it. And then a few days go by, they do it again. So when you're talking about enforcement and regulations and compliance, you have a legal history of what they have been doing. And so their compliance monitoring piece, as Sherry mentioned, is whatever compliance, whatever sort of regulations this committee proposes, those data sets can be programmed. So I think someone mentioned Homestead Exemption, for example, that we could upload our list of all homestead exemptions in Clarke County to the host compliance site. It would include all of them. And then it would match the short-term rentals. And if we find that there are 50% of short-term rentals that aren't in compliance with the homestead exemption rule, we can then send out a form letter that's already pre-built with the evidence that they are actually a short-term listing, or they're trying to rent their units, and just send the letter out. That's part of the service that host compliance provides. They actually print the letter, fold the letter, stuff the envelope, attach the stamp, and send it to the post office. So that's, nothing needs to be done other than staff clicks a button and says send a letter. That can be automated, but they do recommend that be a human do that. And this is just some of the evidence that we can provide to them. We can provide any sort of legal, whatever you call that, legal declaration, and then any sort of evidence that we have. It can all be combined and then sent to them at the same time. Again, a similar letter, blah, 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 you're not in compliance. Here's your listing that we see. Please get in compliance. The next piece is a 24/7 hotline. Again, Sherry should be doing this. But there's potential for the short-term rental owners to register with the county to provide an emergency contact number or anything like that. So if there is a problem that neighbors or the police see going on the property, they can call a 1-800 hotline that is manned by the host compliance team. They look for the property address, they find the contact information and reach out to the owner. If there is no owner listed, whatever our next step would be, was it code enforcement, is it the police department? That's their next call. So they will do what they can to take the call and make sure the owner or the police department is contacted to take a look at what's going on. There is a way, especially if those nosy neighbors who know that they're neighbors in the short-term rental unit, there's an app that they can put on their phone. They can take pictures with it and send it up to host compliance and report things. So there's a lot of things that can be done in this 24/7 and compliance piece. That's pretty neat. And then those activities are stored within the system. And as Sherry mentioned, if a property exceeds 3, 5, whatever's in the regulations, they will be notified that their short-term rental should be taken down and they're out of compliance, they're against the law, all that fun stuff. Again, all this stuff can be seen on a laptop, on our mobile phone, so it can be easy for our code enforcement, law enforcement, whoever, to have advantage in seeing all the data that we need. So just to summarize, they do the address identification for us. They can do compliance monitoring for whatever metrics that we want to give them. Permitting and registration, tax collection, 24/7 hotline, and the rental activity monitoring. I didn't really show a slide on that, but they will monitor approximately how many days that this unit has been rented and approximately how much revenue has been received by this firm. I don't know if it's going to be 100% accurate. I think it's a good faith effort at getting that data, but I don't think it's going to be 100% accurate. And then just for an FYI, there is a cost to this. Each of it's modular, so you don't have to buy every bit of it. But if you did, it would be about $61,000 per year for the number of listings that we have in Clarke County. And that number might be a little bit higher once they add the Winterville numbers to that data set. And other than that, I think that's about it. And then just, they had some regulatory best practices, but y'all are the best practitioners of regulations, so you can read it and take it with a grain of salt.
Thanks, Travis.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Mhm.
Any comments and questions on?
So I'm thinking like whatever comes out of GOC that goes to the Mayor Commission in tandem, you need to be working with code enforcement and police department, where if we pass anything.
I think it depends. I mean, if the goal, if the recommendation is to hire a company like this, the nice thing is that, and again, I don't have any interest particularly in host clients for Anarchist, but just any service that does this is that it takes a big burden off of code enforcement and the police department because it provides this really seemingly excellent alternative way to resolve a lot of this conflict. And also gives neighbors a chance to feel heard. I think you can all imagine neighbors who are really frustrated by the short-term rental use, but don't feel it's appropriate to be calling the police every time renters leave trash out inappropriately or have way too many cars or that sort of thing. I think it's certainly always a good idea to involve them, but I would say nothing about what's going to happen here is probably going to make their jobs harder. I may be wrong about that, but in the sense that any complaints about existing laws can already go to them currently. I guess the only difference would be if we did impose a regulation system like Atlanta. I will tell you that when I looked at both of those, they each have their own departments with multiple staff members, and all they do is enforce the different short-term rental policies, ordinances. So it may be a question of whether additional staff would be assigned if the plan is to handle this all in-house.
Yeah, and later on in the discussion, we could definitely bring staff from other departments and talk about the operational impact it would be. Once we better understand what y'all are thinking.
So I have a question. Why can't, or could we just qualify short-term rentals as hotels and fold that into our allowed uses in our zone? Maybe with some exemptions or some special use permit allowances, and just start addressing it that way, but use software like this to enforce it, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to make it clear in our zoning that they qualify as hotels and just should be treated the same, and yeah, absolutely, we do that. I think the question is if you want to restrict them, if you want to say that they only can be in certain areas.
Because hotels, you can't put a hotel in a single family neighborhood. Can you put a hotel in a RS1? I'm not even sure.
Well, that's a good point. I think I'm not prepared to speak to that. I think you should probably talk to Brad about
Yeah, I
that.
feel like we should have somebody from planning come talk to us.
Brad will be
I think
good.
that would be like the most straightforward, easiest way to deal with this, because zoning is defensible. And that's clearly a charge of local government.
Be drastically regulate. I mean, basically at that point, I think you would just have it would basically effectively outlaw Airbnbs, not.
Well, I mean.
It's still commercial.
Yeah, it is.
Right, Fiji, yeah.
Yeah, but if you, I mean, maybe we would readdress our zoning code and allow hotels in other, certain sizes, and some of these would fall into the smaller sizes. But, I mean, I kind of feel like, if you have an Airbnb on the property that we live in, that should that's fine, that should not be regulated. Maybe taxes certainly should be, and if you're a local resident, I feel like you should have more leeway to operate these, but yeah, the thing is, outside investors coming in, buying up local property, who may or may not be monitoring the uses of those properties, that's a whole other issue, and that's why I feel like, maybe we can offer a definition that folds into our special use permit category.
Is the one thing I was going to say to that is that if you did do that, unless I think Tim pointed out correctly, like almost outlawed, then you're back to that grandfathered issue.
Yeah.
All of the currently existing ones would be grandfathered in until such point as.
Yeah, I mean, and I get that, like,
Okay, so-
you look at neighborhoods, like my neighborhood in Boulevard, when it became single family zone, there's a whole bunch of large old houses that are grandfathered in as, apartment buildings, and that's fine, slowly some of them have converted back to single family, but you don't have like the whole wash of them.
So that's, okay, so I like that. Just classify them as hotels, grandfather in for 5 years,
That was just me throwing that out, by the way.
but that's a possibility, right? As a,
Is anybody else?
yeah, is anybody?
That's folding them into their zoning code?
Oh, there's definitely plenty who've moved them. I think most are defining them as short-term rentals to keep it really clear because of that exact problem. How do you treat them all exactly the same when they're very different uses? But I can go back and look and see if I can find one that's
I
doing.
mean, I really don't see how a short-term rental is really different than a hotel.
Well, maybe something we could do now is just talk about what y'all's goals are and the problems you're trying to solve. So as staff, we can think about what we might want to bring to y'all next month.
Yeah.
So I heard Commissioner Link talking a little bit about some of her goals. Just wanted to make sure that we're all sharing so we understand what we might need to develop or look at for next month.
I got the classic one, just the constant traffic, the noise, the parties. One of my constituents had issues also just with trash. If you got that once a week pickup and somebody's rented 3 times that week and their trash is overflow, so trash, noise, parties, that type of stuff, and the traffic, the street.
I mean, I had, basically 2 things. One of them being, just, regulating these in a way to deter nuisances in these neighborhoods and especially residential areas, but across the entire county. But my big thing here is, as I put it, was, limit number of short-term rentals to a healthy number for our community, neighborhoods, housing stock, and housing affordability. And to me, that is an integral part of what needs to happen here is that the actual number of these units available in Athens has to be somehow limited. I think we're not probably in the same extreme as, say, Savannah is, but I think that there are some similarities and some things that entice people to want to open up short-term rentals here in Athens-Clarke County to a point that it is now at an unhealthy level for our housing stock in our community, and that has to be dealt with.
I mean, that's my big concern, in addition to the general nuisances, which, we could address through our code enforcement if we really do. But it's the impact on our housing crisis situation, and there are homes out there sitting empty much of the year that could be housing families. But they're short-term rentals that are making large profits in short amounts of time for the people that own them and not providing actual homes for people.
Yeah, I misunderstood the question, but
No, I think you answered.
Yeah.
Shared some of the things you wanted to see solved.
other than yeah.
And I want to, see, I think we're going to have to go down, whether it's host compliance or some other entity. Again, I think that's just an integral component to whatever we end up doing here. I think even we're seeing different structured ordinances still are relying upon a mechanism like that. And also I look at the cost, $61,000 right now, and I'm assuming that we'll probably pick up some extra revenue that we're leaving on the table right now that will help cover that cost. So it's,
I I also wonder, I mean, hotels have to pay an annual business license, correct? I mean, if we were to regulate them like hotels, there would be that licensing fee.
And I can't remember exactly how Clinton County refers to it, but that's exactly what we would do, is we would require, like, you have to pay your tax, and also you have a mandatory annual application fee, which my guess is that we might, it might make sense for us to roll it into our business occupation
If you
tax.
charge them $60, we pick up that,
Right.
that $61,000.
Clinton County charges $150 annually.
I mean,
Yeah.
we could pick up that $61,000, then some.
Yeah.
Not,
Just like, I'm actually gonna talk about at the end here about somehow people can get public comment into it, but yeah, at the end of the meeting, yeah.
so, just hearing y'all talk, one of the potentials that we can explore, I don't know if this is possible, but is there a way from the data from somebody like host compliance to better understand what percent of the 1,000 are simply used for short-term rentals? I don't know if that's something that you would have to use host compliance, something like that, for a full year to tell, or if it's something that they've tracked over time. But I think that's one of the underlying questions y'all are asking here is, which one of these are weekends, game weekends, graduation versus all they do is rent as a short-term.
Well, I mean, I don't know about the Homestead Exemption, but this is a modular product, so if you're really, really interested in trying to really dive into the data and see where this can take you, is the address identification is a small part of that 61,000, and so is that rental activity monitoring, and you just sit and watch if you wanted to, and then just kind of get the data, get some ideas, we can pull the departments in to get other data sets, and then you can kind of really get a better picture of it. But it's an expense that not legit, but we can figure something out.
And I guess, Sherry, I was wondering, because I understand like trying to do the zoning kind of method rather. I mean, I guess I was thinking of like possibly like a combination somehow where you could say, I guess a little bit of Savannah did, like, in this specific overlay district in this area, they will only be allowed a certain number. I mean, do you still think that's still going like the zoning method, or because you're getting into like limited quantities, it's?
I think it's better, because you're tying it to like the needs of the community is what you would say. We're trying to preserve the character, and we recognize that this area can only support so much, is I think the argument you make, as opposed to saying kind of arbitrarily, Sherry, you can only have 2 because we just want to limit them. You know what I mean? So I think it's more defensible, but we just don't have that case to say how the courts are going to decide. And so, it's the problem with all this is we're just kind of on the cutting edge until there's some better case law out there. One thing I didn't say to you earlier that I should have, because a number of these cases have been litigated extensively, and we talked to Ken Gerard about that statute that I showed you at the very beginning about not doing the rental registry. He said that in the litigation that they've all had so far, that argument has not come up. But that's only because they've been in the argument of the cases so far have argued about whether someone was grandfathered in, whether the ordinance was legal to begin with. So now some of these cases are moving into the enforcement side of things, and he's seeing that argument start to come up in the enforcement. In other words, your ordinance is fine, but you can't apply it to me because it is based on this registration. And so we may in the coming years have a better idea of how the argument's going to play out, but we just don't know yet.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess the last thing that I have to say with it, just like whatever we do here, I think whichever method we go, the end goal here has to be putting some kind of cap on the number of short-term rentals we have, which I know makes it a little challenging legal, but I feel like that's the real pressing matter here. Y'all have any other comments or requests to staff as we're moving forward here about?
Cap is a very strong word. Putting a cap. Just my view is just you're out in the country and you have a whole bunch of Airbnbs or VRBOs or whatever, just kind of I can see it in commercial districts, but like there's more of those short-term rentals out in my area and Jesse's area. It's making homes more costly. it's destroying neighborhoods,
Right.
expensive, but like, I don't know, putting a cap on it though, like,
I think the cap should be more neighborhood based.
there you go.
I mean, that's
Oh,
something
sure.
where like an SGP process could be helpful because if there's some kind of, qualification on, if there are too many of this use in a particular area, that's one of the qualifications that we look at when determining whether or not to grant an SGP. So you could take a look, and if somebody was applying for an SGP in a neighborhood to have an Airbnb, you could say, well, there's already 4 within 2 blocks of that. That's a little much. Or you could say, hey, there aren't any in this neighborhood.
Kind of like Savannah with their permitting. Something similar.
Yep, I think that's absolutely valid. The only downside is that the more operationally complex you get, the more difficult and therefore more likely to require.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I feel like, the SGP should be kind of a next level process. There should be some pretty clear qualifications where they're allowed in these areas. Then when you get beyond those areas, maybe an SGP kicks in. And I feel like qualifying them as hotels could be the way to go. And just stick it within the zoning code.
Yeah, I guess if we go like SUP model, I guess I'd see the planning department getting a little bit overrun possibly with special use permit requests because they're having, yeah.
I mean, that's maybe where we might have to hire someone to process those particular SUPs like they do apparently in Savannah, right?
I know all of these folks have teams of people. I don't know exactly what those folks specifically do. We can find out. We tried to find out.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find out what their like administrative process is for handling these applications.
And Sherry, I know you said that like the Atlanta, and I've heard the same rumors too about that supposedly the players here would be more okay with something like Atlanta rather. I mean, honestly, where I was kind of like the most basic idea I was thinking was the Atlanta style, and I know that's like kind of, the mayor was kind of directing us on that one, but the Atlanta style ordinance, but just removing the primary homeowner clause, because I know that isn't, so basically just saying that anybody can own 2. Because I guess I feel like we're not gonna get overrun by some large company trying to move in if they can only buy 2. Like if you're limited to just 2 per town in the Athens-Clarke County, it's that you're not going to have somebody come in and try. I mean, they can't operate like 60 and so.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, that was kind of what I was thinking about as a bit of a, I guess, simplified model. But I know, yeah, just put it out
I
there.
mean, I do feel like the Atlanta one is very restrictive in that it doesn't allow anyone who does not technically live in Atlanta. We have lots of folks who keep their bulldog party home, maybe they do spend 3 or 4 months in Athens if they have a home elsewhere. And anyone who actually does live in town and is able to directly monitor the property on a regular basis, should be given a little more.
Yeah, I'll just say finally, just so it doesn't get lost, I do think that the idea of limiting just to maybe falls afoul of that interfering with the private contract argument, that's where we get into that argument. This doesn't mean we can't try it, it's just that's a vulnerability of that kind of ordinance.
How do I look up Greene County short-term rental? How did you find that?
I did, short-term rental, Georgia regulation, Greene County.
And we can look that up too and send it out with all this other stuff as well.
Yeah, put in the words Georgia and regulation in there. And should
Okay.
Green County has some regs.
They require, they created an overlay district, short-term rental overlay district. You can only get a permit for it if it's within the overlay district. Yeah. And I think they're using post compliance too.
Cool. This has been helpful. I think y'all gave us some good insight about where you're heading, and we can begin some research related to that. Is there anything else, any other questions, anything else y'all want to share tonight?
I guess the last thing I was gonna put on there, Josh, or to talk about to see if you and Cynthia could possibly more making the agendas moving forward, to put on there somewhere a clause that for public comment people can send public comment to my email, and that I'll share that with all committee members, just that there is a mechanism for us to take public comment.
Can we have somebody from planning at our next meeting?
Yes, Brad would be here if he were in the office today, but
Okay.
yeah, we had plans to come.
Yeah.
But he'll be here next month.
I have lots of questions. It would be helpful if they could bring that chart that's embedded in the code or send us that chart that has all the allowed uses in all the zones.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to find, so it's embedded in the code. It'd be really helpful if it was just a free floating chart that we could access.
Definitely, no, he was sad to miss this, but,
I'm sure.
yes, he will be here. And I think we've got plenty to talk about as staff, and we'll make sure we'll bring some examples and bring some information and continue to drive the conversation.
Definitely, okay. Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, and, yeah, thank you, Sherry, and thank you, Travis, for, presenting to us. We don't have anything else, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second,
All in favor?
okay,
fantastic.
happy Monday.
I'll be happy to come talk to you, I was gonna like try to.